So in case you don't want your picture to be seen, you can keep your camera off. We will have the speakers spotlighted so that in the recording, basically, what is visible is the speaker. My name is Antti Pentikainen, and I am the director of the Mary Hoch Canter for Reconciliation, which has the honor to host this conversation. We are really thrilled and honored to have 4 significant actors to join us in this conversation with real-life practical experience on negotiation attempts with al-Shabaab and some of the other Islamist groups in Somalia and the Horn of Africa. And to my knowledge, this may be the first time when a group of or all these participants combined are speaking about these experiences publicly. So I think it is a very unique webinar that will provide some insights and background that have not been shared before. So let me just a little bit start with the context of going back into the days when al-Shabaab was established. It was some years after the so-called war on terror had catch full speed, which obviously happened after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. And as a response, this became the era of war on terror that affected a lot of the war-torn places and countries. And as we do remember, the principal policy on the time on the war on terror was that negotiations with terrorists and terrorist groups could not be conducted. In the Somali case, there was UN-sanctioned groups such as al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya, which was claimed to have been involved at least in financing, but possibly also in organizing of the East Africa terrorist bombings of the embassies in Tanzania and Nairobi. And some of the individuals, including Sheikh Hassan Tahir West, were sanctioned and listed as terrorists on their engagement with al-Ittihad and further on. So obviously the war on terror had already effects and was reflecting or changing, affecting the realities in Somalia. So we have prepared a timeline that I will share, and I will start with the speakers soon to go through that timeline, and then we'll be reflecting after the timeline a little bit on the lessons learned and recommendations from these negotiations attempts that we can share with you. But let me first present the speakers through the timeline order that I'm going to engage with them. First one is Abdullahi Farah, or as we call him, Sujud, the one with the righteous path. He's a very close friend and a colleague who has been working on these issues all the way since 2006 onwards. After speaking with Abdullahi, I will invite Christian Manahl to the spotlight, and he was the Deputy UN Special Representative on Somalia. He spent there a couple of years, and he was involved with a lot of work that I was also involved with, including the tribal elders negotiations and also negotiations offer that came directly to him from al-Shabaab. After Christian, I will invite Patrick Lodge to the spotlight. Patrick led the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program of the UN since 2013 all the way, I think, to 2016 or 17. And after Patrick, I will invite Rowda Olad to the spotlight, and we will be discussing Rowda's work with the high-risk inmates in the Baidoa prison, as well as her work in the Somali context with trauma and her reflection on al-Shabaab. And then we will have a round of reflection on all of these lessons learned. And then my ask for you participants is that you will be typing your questions. So Amanda, who has been helping to convene this panel, will be helping us to recognize those questions, and we'll go back to them after our round of discussions. So let's start with you, Abdullahi, and I will pull the timeline. You were in Somalia at the time of the Islamic Courts Union, and you became a member of the Islamic Courts Union, and got to know a lot of the leaders that later were involved in the negotiations. And once Ethiopian occupation started and ended a couple of months period of the Islamic Courts Union, a lot of these actors went to Eritrea, where a new group was formed, Alliance for Re-Liberation of Somalia, and you became a member of their executive board. I'd like to ask Abdullahi, first from you, you often say that you are a pacifist Islamist. What does that mean?
I'm welcoming all. Thank you very much, Antti. The word of pacifist Islamist, actually, if I try to explain in my words, I believe that I'm the real Muslim when always Islam encourages to be in a middle, not a side. So, and I believe that I'm in a middle. I like to be a person, a Muslim person, and I don't like to actually go aside anyway. So that's what can I say if I explain to my in my words.
I remember meeting you first time, I think it was 2008. We were sitting in a fast food restaurant, and you said that you could talk to the leaders of those who had left Somalia and organize meetings with them, and then you placed a call to Hassan Tahir West, and I introduced you to Pekka Haavisto, our current foreign minister, and you started to organize meetings for us in Eritrea, Asmara, and got very much involved with these efforts for years. What was the main reason? Why did you want to engage in such dialogue efforts? Why was it significant to you?
All right. I felt that we are focusing on how this started and where this ideology came from. But to your question, if you said why you wanted to do that, because of there was no other way to solve the problems unless you start in negotiations. I've been using to say all the time that militarily it is possible to defeat, but no one can eliminate, and no one can erase that idea in the brain of the people. So you can kill the people, but you can't kill the ideology. So the ideology always needs a negotiation and talking and sitting together and listen to each other. So that was my perspective.
And once we went to Asmara, then the future president Sheikh Sharif Ahmed was there, as well as Hassan Tahir West. They had formed leadership of the ARS. Can you a little bit speak about the efforts before Djibouti negotiations and during the Djibouti peace agreement, very briefly?
Actually, my real negotiation started after when they split the IRS to become two groups. It was not I was not interested to join the President Sharif's group or Sheikh Hassan's group, but I knew that they need each other. They need to combine, to come together. So, and that's why I put on my shoulders that responsibility to try at least to bring them together.
So there were mediation attempts. I was traveling with you to Djibouti trying to explain to Sheikh Sharif that even if he joins the government, much larger groups should be brought in. There was a meeting in South Africa and also in Saudi Arabia. Eventually, that didn't become successful. Do you want to reflect why that mediation didn't succeed?
You mean the success of in between two groups, you mean?
Yes.
That was really simple, and I think Christian Manahl can remember, or even you were there, and also Becca Havisto was there. So it was just as simple. It was that the Sheikh Sharif saw the Somali leadership in a window. He saw the chair of Somalia in the window. The Walid Abdullah, UN representative, he clearly said to him, if you listen to us, you will be the president of Somalia. Then Sheikh Sharif, he and his team got that interest, and they don't want to listen others. That was a part of the what caused the failure. Another thing was Sheikh Hassan sees Sheikh Sharif as his son, so he was quite, how can I say, it's not a good word to say, I think, but he was somehow jealous that his son took over the opportunity and become a Somali president. So, and he was not going to allow him to be in that position and leave him behind.
So there was a power struggle between these characters. One of them chose to join you, and then one chose not to join, but established his own group with the remaining groups that had not joined. Then al-Shabaab, and formed a new group called Hizbul Islam. Sheikh Awais stayed a bit in Asmara. I guess he was a little bit stuck there. The Eritreans didn't let him go, but eventually he returned to fight, like I suppose in two fronts against al-Shabaab, but also the government. You organized and helped to organize 2 rounds of negotiations with Hizbul Islam. One was with Margaret Vogt, when she was the deputy SRSG, and then later directly with UN in Nairobi. Do you want to speak about those attempts, and what have you learned? What did you learn from those?
Actually, we pay a price. We paid a price to make succeed those negotiations, but unfortunately, there was superpowers behind the failure of those mediations. You know what we did together, and we all remember as it was yesterday. We tried a lot. We worked in front of the people and behind scene. We tried in many different ways in many different times. why those attempts has failed is just the international community has neglected. So although Margaret Fox was there, Mahiga was there, it was not their attention. I don't believe that they really they really meant what they were saying to us, or they didn't have a power to implement what they are saying and what they are telling us. So there was, I think there was a superpowers, the decision makers behind them, and they were not going this issue to succeed.
Yes, I think you are referring also to the failure of the mediation that you were helping to organize with the help of Turkey in 2010. And after that mediation was failed or backed off or seized by, you mentioned Mahiga, so he was the UN representative then, Hizbul Islam communicated that it's not able to exist and actually joined al-Shabaab. So the insurgency became more extreme and harder to reach. And I told you at the time that it would be impossible to talk anymore to these people because they have joined a terrorist organization. And it took a while for you to convince me that the dialogue should be still continued, and for me to convince the UN that actually there is an opportunity to have dialogue. But eventually, by August and September 2011, there were preparatory discussions, including a high-level UN representative from the headquarters, Jawa Honwana. They seem to be becoming successful, but eventually also failed. So what is the lessons learned from even the negotiation round in 2011?
All right. That time, Antti, I think you remember, I've been using the word of no peace without negotiation. The negotiation was the only key to bring a peace. The international community were going to defeat the al-Shabaab militarily, and that was easy for them. Although that they didn't do, but it is possible to defeat them militarily. But the ideology is not possible to kill the ideology. The ideology can get in a society, and the society, no one can distinguish who is al-Shabaab and who is not. So the ideology needs to face another ideology, to challenge, to talk, to sit. And I know where they are coming from, that ideology, where it is coming from. So it needs another ideology. So the people on the Somali society can decide who is right and who is not. So the lessons learned about that is just to believe that no peace without negotiations. You see what has happened in Afghanistan. The negotiation become a conversation. And everywhere the negotiation has to follow that same route. And I believe now there is a war on al-Shabaab in Somalia, and still I'm saying if there is no negotiation, no one can win at all. We know the ideology, we know its roots, we know where it started, and also I don't mean when it started in Somalia, but the ideology, this ideology, when and where it has started, we know it is about 1,000 years ago. So this ideology needs to face with another ideology. So that is what I believe, and I believe that before, and I will believe that later as well.
Thank you, Abdullahi. And like all of you, you know, have seen, we have covered quite a many years in just a couple of minutes, starting from the Islamic Courts Union when al-Shabaab was taking form. And after the Ethiopian occupation, al-Shabaab started to gain more power, was the fighting force became the fighting force that stayed in Somalia and started to take and gain more and more popular support and territory, eventually controlling very significant parts of Somalia. And like Abdullahi said, it'll be nearly impossible to win a group that has covered so much of territory and had under its power so many people, many millions of people. And with the different forms of ideology or radicalization, there has to be a multiple of strategies if you want to address an insurgency or a group like this. So eventually you showed to us through your effort that a full group cannot just be labeled as a terrorist, but have to be also negotiated with. But the international community wasn't ready to receive those negotiations. The final round that Abdullahi and I got involved was the discussions on 2012 with Honvana that were transferred to Mahiga's responsibility. In the negotiations, the preparatory discussions with Honvana, he suggested for those who want to break away from Shabaab to denounce terrorism, split from Al-Qaeda, establish a political party, call for a ceasefire, and agree to negotiate on political inclusion based on Somali constitution. And actually, the leaders who had sent their representative to meet with Honvana did that in November of 2012, before the establishment of the Islamic State in the Levant. This was before they used the same name, but they established a group called Al-Imarat al-Islamiyya of Somalia. So they went public with those commitments. Unfortunately, UN then didn't follow through, and a lot of those who became involved with the group got killed with the more radical elements, and those efforts ceased. Christian, Manahl, you would be our next spotlight. Thank you, Abdullahi. We'll come back to you. So Amanda, you could spotlight Christian. He became the Deputy UN Secretary General Special Representative in Somalia. I think it was 2011, if I'm not mistaken, and you stayed there, I think, for 2 years, almost 2 years. Those years were not easy. For us, you were quite exceptional. You're an official like Margaret Vogt, but you started to face some difficulties because of our collaboration. Also, Bob approached you during the famine. So there was just a famine when the last negotiation attempt I described with Abdullahi failed. They then approached you directly, suggesting to discuss the ceasefire in Mogadishu. So would you like to speak about those efforts and what you learned and where they ended?
Yes, thank you, Antti, and good afternoon, everybody. Perhaps I should start by a comment concerning the title that you put when you advertised this workshop. You said negotiating with the terrorist. I think it's important to realize that there is a difference between negotiating and mediating or facilitating. Obviously, in general language, we talk about the negotiation as the entire process, but strictly speaking, it is the parties which have to negotiate. The United Nations, which I represented at the time that you were talking about and that we are discussing here in this conference, since I represented the United Nations, I was not planning to negotiate. I was planning to facilitate, to mediate. And it is also important because we mentioned this to al-Shabaab when they approached me through a clan relative from Canada, because they came and said, this person came to me and said, al-Shabaab wants to talk to the UN, not to the government. And I said, fair enough, yeah, we'll see what we can do. We're open to listen to you, but be aware that eventually negotiations will not be with the UN, but with the government and with the society of Somalia. We can only play a facilitating role. And of course, I was happy to attempt this facilitating role, because as a matter of principle, I believe one should always try to explore options to settle armed conflicts peacefully, for the sake of the victims and for the sake of the countries, the societies that are concerned by these conflicts and that are set back in terms of development and in terms of all the other opportunities. It is important also to be aware that this is not the same as being neutral. It does not mean that those who try to facilitate or eventually to mediate condone the crimes that were committed, are indifferent to the responsibility of who started the violence. Also often in practice, this responsibility is shared. And certainly not being indifferent to human rights, because it is one of the objectives, of course, of the United Nations to promote, preserve, and protect human rights. And if we do engage in facilitation or mediation, it's precisely because we want to mitigate human rights violations and eventually end them if possible. Because war, armed conflict always comes with human rights violations. And that perhaps also raises one of the other questions that you have put to me in our preliminary discussions about ethical considerations. Is it right to talk to people who have committed crimes, sometimes crimes against humanity or war crimes? I think the question is not, is it ethical? It's inevitable, because usually in situations of armed conflict, most of the leaders that are involved in such conflicts have quite a heavy record of human rights violations. If everybody respected human rights, if everybody respected law and international law, there wouldn't be any conflicts. So it is inevitable to talk to people who have a heavy human rights record, sometimes to people who have literally the blood dripping from their hands. We have to talk to these people if we want to make peace. I think it is important to put that out in the background so that there is no misunderstanding about the positions that are taken by facilitators or mediators. Trying to achieve a negotiated settlement does not mean condoning violence. It does not mean condoning crimes. It does not mean condoning human rights. But it is a necessity to talk to people who have a record on these issues. Now, al-Shabaab approached me through this clan relative. They were suspicious of the government, and that's often the case in a conflict. Trust is minimal, suspicion is great, fear between the parties very often, so they try to go through an intermediate. And in this case, that was the United Nations. And since the United Nations was also materially supporting through its administrative support the African Union mission, it was in our interest to look at the offer that al-Shabaab was making. And while for me, of course, I was not sure, I couldn't be sure whether this contact is genuine, whether this offer is genuine. But the offer they made was interesting in that respect, because they offered a ceasefire for Mogadishu at a time when there were several terrorist attacks every day in the city. And it would have been very easy to find out whether these people are genuine, whether these are really the people who have the power to stop this business, if we had been able to engage with them. I did, of course, inform my boss, SRSG Mahiga, and of course, UN headquarters. I also spoke to the Ugandan force commander, who was very interested in this initiative. And he transferred the message to Addis Ababa, to the headquarters of the African Union. And then unfortunately, we didn't hear back. As time passed by, you have to give these people an answer, either yes or no. If you say nothing, that essentially means that the initiative fizzles out, and this is what was happened, which is regrettable. Perhaps I should have pressed harder with my own headquarters at the time to say, tell us something, even tell us not to go ahead if that is what the decision in New York is, but tell us something so that I can go back. I did, perhaps I should mention that, contact the United States, because we knew that they had operatives in Somalia in support of the government at the time. And of course, anti-terrorist operations, that I didn't want to be caught in the crossfire. So I did mention this to the US representative and asked him whether he could check whether Washington was okay with the UN going ahead with this. And they did indeed say, yes, we have no objections to that. Whether they had a lot of belief in this initiative is another matter, but it was important for me to cover my back, so to speak. I still believe that after now, 3 decades of armed conflict in southern Somalia, every opportunity for a peaceful settlement should be explored. That doesn't mean that the government should stop fighting al-Shabaab. Fighting and talking usually goes hand in hand. In many cases, this happens. We see it now in Sudan as well. And often it takes time to build a minimum level of confidence that actually gets negotiations going. So what is sometimes described as a dichotomy, either fighting or negotiating, indeed in practice, in reality, often happens in parallel. It has to happen in parallel. You start talking to people while the fighting goes on. You lay the groundwork, you explore positions, you lay the foundations, and eventually when you see that there is a critical mass of political will on the side of the parties, then you push ahead. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I gave my...
Thank you, Christian. I think you outlined it really well, that you actually for following through what you believe to be the UN's mission or UN's task to find out if there could be a negotiated solution with the parties, assisted by the UN or someone else. And you got the African Union Force Commander excited, and both of you reported to your supervisors, and you never got a response back. Do you want to guess why?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Perhaps one of the mistakes I made, I should have discussed it in more detail, perhaps with SRSG Mahiga, because it was him who had the relations with the governments of the region, with Kenya, with Ethiopia, with Uganda, with Burundi, as both providing countries. And perhaps I should have convinced him to bring these countries, the leadership of these countries, into the picture from the beginning, and to make sure that they back this initiative and do so explicitly also up to the level of headquarters in New York. We were all under time pressure. There were a lot of things ongoing, and of course, it was my oversight in that respect, because I should have worked harder to make sure that this is happening. On the other hand, of course, this was a very discreet initiative. It wasn't secret, but it was discreet. We didn't want to make a lot of publicity, in particular in the beginning. Eventually, if negotiations would have happened, obviously it would have become known. But it was a delicate process that had to be nurtured with a certain discretion, and we didn't want to broadly publicize it from the beginning. So perhaps this has also...
Yeah, I would have one more question to
yes,
you,
please.
Christian. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for continuous, honest reflection. I think that's really helpful for those who are wanting to learn from these cases. If you would have gotten the permission from Mahiga or the UN headquarters or strong support from the regional powers, I think you described that there is a very complex reality. Not only the parties are involved or fighting on the ground, but you also have regional interest and politics involved that have to be managed. But would you have been successful first to have a ceasefire in Mogadishu as a pretext towards a broader negotiation? What would have happened in Somalia? What would be the situation with the conflict today?
Oh, we don't know. We don't know whether we would have been successful. It's impossible to tell. The late Augustin Mahiga did not object to the initiative. He gave me explicitly his backing for it, but perhaps, as I said, I should have tried to convince him to bring stronger regional support into the picture, because of course we knew that the government was very, very reluctant. And of course the government found out very quickly about it, was skeptical, was not happy about what we were doing, and we could have perhaps managed this reluctance or resistance on the side of the government by strong regional pressure. If we had been successful, if there had been a ceasefire for Mogadishu, that would have been a first step to see where that leads to. I do believe that in Somalia, and as in many other conflict situations, groups like al-Shabaab, which have a very radical extremist agenda, often graft themselves on genuine local grievances. That and this is a point, I think, where we have a bit of leverage. If we acknowledge that there are grievances of the local people which are legitimate, that have to be addressed, that helps us to find ground to start talks with these groups. Whether eventually it would have been successful, nobody knows, but it's always worth trying. And I believe it has to be tried again. If after more than, what now, 10 years, 15 years of fighting, they have not been defeated, that in itself, I think, is reason enough to say, let's try something else. Not necessarily as an alternative, but as a parallel track to the military operations which are ongoing.
Thank you, Christian. So we'll come back to you after I have discussed a bit with Patrick and Rowda, but thank you for these really insightful, honest, direct reflections. Patrick Lotz became the director of the UN Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration in Somalia for the United Nations. The way we worked together was that if in our negotiation attempts a group or individual wanted to give themselves up, it was Patrick who received them. You sometimes said, Patrick, that you wanted the Shabaab who were in prison to know that you were their best friend. So can you describe a bit briefly, what did you do and why did you think this way?
Andy, thank you very much for the privilege. And I wasn't the director, but I was directing it. Maybe that's a good way of looking at it. Yes, just a short little background. I joined the UN mission in Somalia in 2013. So I, as Christian, just I think you went out and I went in. My position was heading the DDR team, which responsibilities, the main responsibility was to develop a national program for disengage al-Shabaab, whether it was defected or surrendered in one way or the other, or arrested in one way or the other. So we supported the federal government in developing the national program. But in order for us to develop the program, we had to understand what we are working with, what our problems would be. And in order to ensure that we were hands-on, I had an incredible small but fantastic team. And I have to mention them. Abdullahi Farah was one of the first victims of a suicide bomber in Somalia, and also Masatomo Yamaguchi from Japan, who was an incredible team. We had a very small team, and we later on then expanded. But we started off by going to every little region, every little prison that we could possibly go to. And we met as many al-Shabaab that were kept in one way or the other, whether it's custody or some transit facility, interim facility. And we sat literally with them in cells under trees and understood where they came from and where they think they might be heading to. We worked very closely with the federal government of Somalia to make sure that what we are supporting them with is what they expect, and then also what they see the future of. It was not easy. It was quite difficult. We worked within a legal framework, and I know Christian also mentioned it earlier. It's a very complicated world. It's you've got international humanitarian law, you've got international criminal law, you've got the local laws in Somalia. So a combination of legal swords that are hanging over your head. And then quite rightly, all the issues that Christian mentioned, as the UN itself we had the same issues, and it just continued. However, I think we were very successful. We established a rehabilitation facility, the first one in Baidoa. It was an incredible move forward. It was quite positive. And that put us in a position to actually then start analyzing the individual al-Shabaab members who came to the facilities. We also established the first facility for female al-Shabaabs, which, according to general understanding, they were never females. We established safe houses in Baidoa that provided environment for females and their children to enter and to move forward and see themselves some kind of future. We also work very closely with the communities. For us, the community was quite important, because the next phase for us was whether we see these individuals moving on and going back into the community, whether it's going through a whole process. The national program, however, made provision for an initial phase where we had to classify these al-Shabaab, we had to categorize them in high risk, low risk, etc. That was one of our main issues. And the very nice French no refoulement, which basically say you cannot just hand over individuals or support a program, and the UN could not support a program that part of the program which we developed and support the government with might have a component where some individuals are handed over to the government, and we also, and the serious threat of death penalties was part of this whole arena in which we moved in. And that was very complicated. Within the UN framework, we worked within the Office of the Rule of Law and Security Institutions Group. We also had a magnitude of rules, and the overriding rule of the UN is also do no harm. It doesn't make sense for us to go to a country and do more harm than good. But
well, I must say, Patrick, you, like Christian, you were also quite exceptional. I'm happy to see that there are many exceptional people in the UN, but you also chose to do your best. And I think al-Shabaab recognized you as someone that can be trusted, that they had identified Christian before, and they eventually came and approached you seeking if you could help to reestablish a negotiation contact. Before that, some things happened. I mean, you had established that track record by seeing people being reliable, by being honest as you received them. But then coincidentally, you ended up with your wife in the middle of the Westgate attack and survived that horrible attack. And once al-Shabaab met you, they asked you, did you come back to give revenge, or what is your motivation? So my question is, could you a little bit speak about the ethical choices you made and the rationale why you believe that not only treating them well, but also negotiations were something meaningful to explore.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Antti, just a little, I'm going to try and keep it very short. My background being in South Africa, I was also in some explosions in South Africa in my earlier life while I was a student at Pretoria University. And then later on, when I studied law, I joined the military, and in the legal department, one of my first responsibilities was to establish a working group with our current government at that time that some countries even branded as terrorists. So I was sitting around the table and had to establish some kind of negotiations with them. And that was in 1993. So when I arrived in 2013 in Somalia, it was a bit of a deja vu. And then when I ended up one morning going with my wife for a coffee and a breakfast at Westgate Mall, suddenly we were full under attack. It was quite going back to where I came from. And we survived the attack. We were quite fortunate. South African government, I must always have to recommend how highly they supported us during that time. And then I was approached in quite strange places, in airports, in transit, and on the ground by a multitude of actors that were requesting the UN support in negotiations. And that was also questioned how real this was, how high up these individuals were. But I am still convinced that that came from the highest level, this request. And this request, I did then move, I conveyed, that was later on, when after we established the first Baidoa program, I think we built some kind of relationship, some kind of trust and there were always these allegations that the al-Shabaab would send some kind of spies, if you call it, to the Baidoa facility, to go into the facility and work from there and use it as a base to understand and to get closer to the enemy. It could be true, but also the fact that they were in the facilities, understand the approach that we followed, that put them in a very difficult contradiction where they felt, but now there's really goodwill here. And I honestly believe that because of the work we've done, that is why we got approached. And that's why there was a reach out to the UN. And I do believe that the UN still have a role. At that time, with our SRSG at that time was Michael Keating. We did move up this request. We conveyed this even up in the higher levels from my office that I worked in, and we conveyed this request for negotiations of kind of agreement or to move forward. History have taught us there's only one way out of Somalia. It is some kind of agreement, whether it's, and I think Christian mentioned it very good. I mean, you've summed it up. It's inevitable. I think that nails it. Inevitable is the word that actually fits in this whole enigma where we found ourselves. And I still believe that in all these kind of scenarios, I just finished 2 years working on Sudan, and what's happening in Sudan now. There's only one way out of this, and it's inevitable. There must be some negotiation. Whether our blood on the hands, that's is relevant, but not so relevant. Colombia is quite a good example where they find some good midway, even in the light of all the history. Somalia, in the light of all the history. I still believe, and I believe that the Somali government, there are really high actors in the current government that still believe that this can be settled and that there's some agreement should be reached in order to find Somalia in an environment where everybody can, in one way or the other, put things behind them and move on.
Yeah, no, thank you, Patrick. And I think you outlined really well the principle of making the reintegration work, because without the reintegration, the people get stuck in the middle and have the temptation or the pressure to return to the fight. We'll also come back to you, Patrick, but I'll move to our next presenter or speaker next. But Michael Keating was actually quite keen in the beginning when he became the UN representative to do a mediation effort. However, he got a little bit sidelined by one of the Nordic countries, Norway, which was promoting their own mediation track at the time. And so Keating didn't eventually become very effective on his effort. But Rowda Olad, who had been trained clinical therapist in the US and had decided to return to Somalia because of the lack of resources in mental health, worked actually in the Baidoa prison program that Patrick mentioned. And Rowda was assigned to work with especially the high risk inmates, which means that these were the commanders or people in the position of power within al-Shabaab. So Rowda, could you a little bit speak about to the mental health element, the trauma element, as well as the current efforts of the Somali government, because you were observing while you were doing your mental health work, how the communities have risen against Shabaab and that there is an ongoing new effort with Somali government, regional administrations, international forces to drive out Shabaab. So what are your recommendations, observations based on your work for the work as we go forward?
Greetings of peace, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for sharing your experience and historical events. And thank you, Antti, for hosting this timely and critical topic, especially in the case of Somalia, where now some communities organize themselves to liberate their regions. And now Somali government is militarily engaging al-Shabaab. Moreover, there is a emerging consensus that military means alone is often countereffective. And there's a search and energy for durable alternative in addition to the military in dealing with both terror organizations and their members, as most of you already mentioned. It's my sincere hope that in conjunction with other advisable approaches, it is a critical attention is seeking the advantage of psychotherapy, MHPSS approaches, as the organizing frameworks for changing the behaviors of individual members of terror networks, as well as influence the cultural roots of membership. If one adopts such tools, we stand a great deal of hope, at least from my experience as a practitioner, of not only effectively understanding the not only understanding the sources and the pathways of recruitment, but also addressing the underlying conditions in ways that we are potentially could exclude any resort to violence, creating a space for collective joint thinking for durable resolutions. And often the lessons I learned from my time working with AS inmates is that AS uses ideological frameworks for recruitment constructed around individual and collective identities. Often their target recruits were individuals from marginalized identities, as most of you know, and youth who grew up in the midst of violence, who might have experienced traumatic events, offering them a sense of belonging, and as well as other psycho-political means. Clinically, individuals who have experienced traumatic events are susceptible falling into traps such those provided by al-Shabaab, in my experience. And also as a practitioner to look for in the lenses of clinician. So therefore, I believe that by incorporating psychotherapy to AS engagement efforts, we can achieve more sustainable outcomes that not only addresses the immediate condition of violence, but can become the basis for prevention. And also this will help the community integration to the members of al-Shabaab. Thank you, Antti, and I'm looking forward to our discussions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rowda. And now I will pull Mohammed Shiri's question, and then we'll go like a free flow of reflection by the panelists, and Amanda, you could now maybe spotlight all of them. Rowda, we understand if you cannot put on your camera, so you just unmute when you feel. But Mohammed made a wonderful observation and question in the chat, and his particular interest was on was Godane as emir involved in the mediation attempts, or were those who were opposing his views leading these efforts? And I think, Abdullahi, you can speak to this. I'm writing now a book actually about these experiences, since I'm not anymore involved, and there is more chance to reflect. And that way I felt from the beginning is that there is a significant group which felt very uncomfortable, even they were part of these groups, for some of the choices that were done or the way they were heading, and were all the time continuously looking for a way out. And obviously, like you refer, Mohammed, there was a power struggle between them. I think the Imarat al-Islamiyah involved very significant part of the Shabaab Shura Council, but there was a rift, as you described in your question, between Godane and those more moderate nationalistic actors who wanted to negotiate. So perhaps, Abdullahi, you can start with this question providing some history of this rift. I think you have spoken to me about the early, things that happened when Shabaab tried to assassinate some of the religious leaders, and the reactions from Awais and Robo on their views, for example. So do you want to speak to this question, and then I'll go to a round of reflection by the other panelists to some of the lessons learned?
Thank you very much, Antti. Before I come to that, I'm going to fail the Antti, you mentioned your first introduction, Ethiopian invasion in Somalia. I'm so happy to hear that in front of international community. We were saying all the time, using to say that this is invasion, but there was people who was disagree. Also, I'm going to mention that there is a people always connecting this extremist and what we are talking about and Islam, and there is no link in between them at all. So, and that I mentioned it in my book, Islam and Extremists, which I published last year. So that is what I'm going to mention first. If I come to your question, the assassination of al-Shabaab, they started earlier of ICU time, and that was not clear for all people, but then later they tried to, or let me say, they developed the assassinationists and the way they assassinate and the people they assassinate. The elders were among the society of Somalia, and why they targeting the elders because they like to be in a chaos. In chaos, the al-Shabaab like this. They don't like an administration. They don't like the connected population to each other. So they like to live in a chaos. They need to lead, or they like to lead the society on their way. So, and therefore, first they have to assassinate the leaders. They have to eliminate the people who lead the people. If it is the elders community, I mean the elders leaders, or if the political leaders or religion leaders or whatever, to get a platform, empty platform, and then that platform they motivate how they like and speak to people how they want. So the elders was not only group they were targeting. I remember, Antti, we were in Asmara at that time. In our hotel, Sheikh Hassan Dahir Awais and General Jama Muhammad Talib, they visited me in my room in Asmara. Sheikh Hassan got a call from Somalia Central Region, Galmudug. Galmudug were not existing at that time, but the capital of Galmudug is Moreb. He got a call informing that the al-Shabaab or some of resistance of Ethiopians, some group, they were, because the al-Shabaab, they was not known that time, trying to kill the elders. For example, you know personally, Antti, the guy, the elder, and Akhil Hassan. You know that guy? He was among the elders. They tried to kill in Somalia at that time. So they shooted one of them in front of the mosque. And then the elder of the Hassan, Akhil Hassan, he took his stick and he beat them, and then they ran it away. They had one pistol, so they were two. So he used his stick, and then they ran it away. So the assassination of elders started from that. As I remember, it can be some before, but according to what I remember, they started from there. And the aim,
you shared that Awais was quite upset hearing that news.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's where I'm going to. They told them that there is an attempt of killing that elders. So, and Sheikh Awais, he gets strongly angry. And he says, he used some words like they are the evils or shayateen. So that is what I can summarize.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the attempts on especially 2011, it came from those opposing Kobane, and I think it was a very genuine, very broad-based outreach, which unfortunately failed. Now, coming back to the reflections from the whole team and Rowda as well, you as well, I think three questions are quite interesting going forward. One is, which entities should lead these kind of efforts, and how to organize the collaboration between UN, the regional actors, and let's say United States, which at least during the war on terror was the one eventually that was calling the shots, to say. Second is a reflection on whether the deflector strategy is efficient. I often argued for the UN that it's not enough to invite individuals, because that can be very corrupt choice. You may choose to deflect once you're somehow stuck in the middle, but with the negotiation, you can actually try to understand what the people's grievances are, and if they're legitimate, to discuss how to address them. And if you are successful, you're actually able to bring a larger group than a single individual. So I'd like to ask your views on that. And third, now when there is this offensive, and Abu Mansour is the Minister of Religious Affairs, and he's been convening religious leaders, spiritual leaders to address the ideology, should al-Shabaab be offered to establish a political office as Taliban did, or how to organize these kind of negotiations? So I would like to just openly ask any one of you, Christian, Patrick, or Rowda. to respond, as well as Abdullahi, if you have additional points.
Will I start?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Who should lead? I would say it doesn't matter that much. I mean, obviously, it's better to have a broad organization like the United Nations or the African Union to lead facilitation or mediation effort, in particular, if it becomes a mediation, not just a facilitation, because these organizations have the legitimacy and broadly speaking, the support of their member states. But often it depends on an individual who is particularly trusted, and it's important to bring these individuals into play at the right moment. How to organize it? It's very important, of course, once a serious process starts, that all the stakeholders are kept in the pictures and hopefully mobilized in support of the process. Both inside the country and outside. Inside the country, of course, the whole of society approach, and many negotiations have different levels or tracks, and it's important to keep as many people involved and mobilized for a peace effort. And of course, outside the country, all the key stakeholders in terms of security, in terms of economic interest. And that's also part of the responsibility of the lead mediator or lead facilitator, to create a structure that gives sufficient information to everybody who has an interest and has a right to know. At the same time, manages sensitive information in a closed circle as long as that is necessary. That's sometimes a difficult balance to strike. But preferably a broad organization in the lead, but with all stakeholders involved, I would say.
Yeah, and it seems like there would be an urgent need for such a mediation entity. When I was helping some of the UN SRSGs to design a mediation process, we had to design it from the scratch. And like you explained, the legal hindrances were very serious. And so establishing the legal framework where such mediation can safely happen would be quite significant, as well as a setup where that coordination can happen effectively, because there is always a lot of politics and hindrances involved. So how to be effective without being stalled all the time is a really practical challenge. But thank you for that.
If I may add a remark,
Patrick and Rowda, would you guys?
I do recognize the importance of a strategic framework, or at least of laying out certain foundations and red lines and so on. But I think it is important to be flexible enough to design the process as you go along. Because once such a process starts and you start interacting with a range of actors which you were not really familiar with and not directly in communication with, then you learn a lot of new things and new avenues open up. I think it's very important to be very flexible and adjust the process. Not to bring a template from the outside and say this is how it has to happen. Each mediation and negotiation process that I have been involved in was different from the other. There are, of course, certain similarities and certain general lessons that you can learn, but I think it's extremely important to be open and flexible and keep your options open and design as you go along.
Very much so. And as you said before, also to have in the government somebody who's actually practically leading and not just getting involved in fighting, as we have seen often with the Somali political actors. So Rowda asked me to repeat some of the questions, and maybe I could hear from Patrick and Rowda some thoughts of this comparison or differentiating or analyzing the difference between a deflector strategy and a mediation or negotiation strategy, where a deflection usually concerns one individual, but in a mediation, you can actually understand what a potential grievances of a larger group is and integrate them as a whole group. So how would you how do you view the effectiveness of these?
Rowda, please go ahead.
So Rowda, do you want to comment this or other points? The other questions I made was who should lead, and should al-Shabaab be offered to establish a political office, perhaps even outside Somalia, to help with the negotiations, so as Taliban was given a chance in Afghanistan?
Those are very important questions. What I see is both approaches are very important, and always engaging in reintegration and al-Shabaab engagement is the lenses I always try experts and practitioners to understand is how we can also address the mass trauma of the country, because these groups are part of the country that have experienced decades of war and conflict. What will be the role of trauma for these negotiations and engagement of these individuals, individually or collectively? So it's very critical, as Chris say, to be open and more flexible engagement approaches. So I agree that.
Thank you, Rowda. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you, Antti. I 100% agree with Christian. It all depends on the situation at then. It's not necessary that 10 years ago, whoever was the right individual or the organization to lead this kind of negotiation, mediation, whether it's deflecting, whatever the status were then, the status now could be different. It's about carpe diem, grab the moment as it is, and then move it on. I wouldn't say there's, it's all depends on the will, whether there's some individual, even an individual person who cannot be connected directly to any organization. But what is most important, I think, and that is Somalia and all these scenarios where we are in this kind of world, is the economic benefits or interest. And if a group or an individual or an organization can move into a position where there's zero economic benefits for this mediator or group in one way or other, that would be the perfect environment for this whole problem to move forward. And that's quite difficult to find that kind of organization or individual, but they are out there. There are a multitude of groups and individuals that are prepared to go into this arena that doesn't necessarily have an interest, but have a personal interest and an understanding of what is going on there and want to achieve a result which would benefit everybody, and specifically the people on the ground, those people that are really suffering, that's been suffering for many years on the ground in Somalia. And therefore I say it should not be cast in stone. There should be some flexibility, and Christian, you've said it, yes, flexibility in designing an approach. We have to also look at the recent ongoing negotiations and mediations that's been ongoing in countries around the Horn of Africa, and see what happened there, what went wrong just recently, just now in the last week or so. Sudan, I have been very closely engaged in supporting the evacuation of South African citizens from Sudan, but I was also in the last 2 years very closely engaged on the ground, and we could see the development of what we have actually found now happening in the last 2 weeks. Somalia, same. It's a historic development of a crisis where we are now, and it's where we get to a point where we say we have to agree to some kind of environment before we reach the point of no return. where there will be no return unless everything is destroyed and there's nothing left. And I think that's the important, and I 100% feel that the economic interest is the major issue that would play the guiding ruler in order to determine a specific group, organization, and also the format of how it should move forward. And I think you've put a very interesting question on the table. Should al-Shabaab have a presence in another country, or to be able to have a platform from where they can launch their arguments and their approaches and their rights as well? That's quite an interesting question. And as you also said before, historically, we have a legal framework not only of the United Nations, a legal framework of international community, a legal framework of specific countries. If it's Norway, if it's the USA or the British, and their approaches towards terrorists as it is. That's quite important to take note of that, because quite right, if you don't have all those big countries on your side, you won't move forward.
Yeah. So I would like to add a couple more points, maybe from a little bit more personal perspective, and also welcome if someone in the audience would like to unmute, because I know that there is incredible knowledge and understanding on these issues, like Mohammed and Abdisalam, or anyone else who feels called. Just raise your hand if you feel comfortable unmuting. But the couple of personal reflections is that one of the things I really fought to explain in the international framework, is that deciding to disengage is a very difficult and ethically demanding choice that has to be respected. We have to see the dignity in the decision of disengagement, because many times these people who decide to disengage, they're risking their lives, taking incredible risks. And unless we see the dignity in that process, or like I told to the UN, in these processes, one cannot just judge what people have done, but also what they can do in the future. And if you're not offering an option of disengagement, what's the purpose of the judgment if there's not even a chance to get out? Maybe if you guys want to reflect on that. But the second point is that 99% of the people I have come across decided not to get involved. Some people, have a strange fascination for negotiations with terrorists, and they go for excitement. But in your case, it was an ethical choice. I know of you all personally, and I know that it was a choice that you made based on your professional and personal ethics. I know, for example, from Abdullahi, one of the people he early on got engaged was Mohammed Tahlil. And they were working together in the Islamic Courts Union, and Mohammed Tahlil remained behind. He had a small charity and did some, food distribution in the al-Shabaab controlled areas during the Ethiopian occupation or that phase of the war. Mohammed Tahlil, to be successful in his humanitarian work, he had to discuss with the Shababs, and he had a very strong conviction that they were going to a wrong direction, and a large part of the leadership didn't agree, and they had to be given a chance to do something else. But Mohammed Tahlil got killed in those efforts. He was assassinated in front of his children in one occasion. And I know, Abdullahi, you yourself have had to face some risks, serious risks. So why have you chosen to continue to taking this risk? Is something that I could, want to ask from all of you.
So that question is to me, right?
Yes, please start, Abdullahi, and then I'm happy to round up with Christian and Patrick.
Brother, I took that risk myself, for example, to save myself was not making any sense. as long as the Somali society is in that chaos, in that agony, in that more than 3 decades civil war. I'm among the people who left Somalia because of that civil war, and I reached in Finland. So I take as my obligation to pay back to the people if I can contribute anything, financially, ideology, any way of supporting. So that was my aim to lead me in, to do that work. And also I had another opportunity. So Finland, the special info Pekka Haavisto and also Antti, they were very close friends. They were keen to do something, if it is possible, to Somalia. So they were my backup, and I was trying to do my best, and that is what pushed me to make a negotiation, mediation, and that was the only entrance to get into Somalia peace situation, or bringing different people together. So although I didn't get that much support in among the Somali society, but I tried my best, and I got the friends, and all we had a limitation, and finally it ended up without any good result.
Yeah, we honor, Abdullahi, your sacrifice and your efforts, and
yeah, I'm going to add that in all efforts of let me say, not all efforts, but the negotiation and peacemaking efforts of international community leave no shade before the currently move led by Somali government in the war on al-Shabaab.
Yeah, the pressures were hard at all the time from different sides. Christian and Patrick, any final comments on your personal motivation and why you chose to make those efforts, join those efforts as well as you could?
Well, personal motivation, I believe it was part of my job and part of my duty. Perhaps a few remarks on the risks. The risks are primarily, I would say, on the sides of the parties. They take risks when they engage in peace talks, but they also take risks when they continue the war. Because they say, as a political leader, you can decide when to start a war, but you cannot always decide when and how to finish it. That's not anymore in your hands. So for the parties, both negotiations and continuing conflict is a risk. For a facilitator or mediator, as long as that person acts in good faith and has the trust of the parties and is reasonably transparent, the risk is less. There is a residual risk in the fact that certain parties or certain individuals, of course, have an interest in continuing the war, often a financial or economic interest. Sometimes we like to believe that everybody wants peace because war is destructive, but the sad reality is that some people do actually profit from war, and these people can feel threatened when a peace process is underway, and in particular when there is a perspective of success. So that has to be taken into account. concerning disengagement that you mentioned before, I think it's important to distinguish between what you call disengagement, which essentially means chipping away at the human resources of the enemy, both at the level of the rank and file and at the level of the leadership. And that's a common practice in war. There's nothing wrong with that as such. But when you engage in serious negotiations with the leadership, I think you have to be careful that you don't mix the two. At one point, I think if you believe that you have honest discussions on track, you have to make a commitment to the people you talk to stop disengagement, because otherwise you're working at cross purposes. Thank you.
Yeah, very good point, except if the group is formed of a lot of tribal affiliations or tribal militias that have their own commanding structures, in some cases they still held, at least Abu Mansour was able to keep his tribal affiliations very strong. Patrick, do you want to make your final comment?
Yes, thank you very much, Antti. And I see Mohammed Shire made a comment regarding the three conditions of al-Shabaab on negotiations. The question which I have, and I also would like to complement what you have said earlier, is when last any group or individual had the privilege to be able to sit with al-Shabaab and in an environment where you are not criticized, where you are not scrutinized, and where you are not judged for doing that, in order to determine exactly what is the status of dignity, what is the conditions that they require, whether it's to negotiate with the federal government of Somalia or with the international community or with the people of Somalia. When last have this privilege been accorded to them? I don't say it should be done, but it should be highly considered, because if you don't understand where they're coming from, and these three conditions, we've heard them for many years. It's not a new condition. It's a condition which has been echoed through multiple years, through multiple leadership in al-Shabaab, but it is always a hearsay kind of type of recollection. And that your question which you posed, should they not be provided an opportunity to have a position where they can be given the opportunity to then provide proper research access in order to determine what they really want and what they really stand for, and for this whole elephant in the room not to be ignored. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. And I think just a minor comment before my closing remarks to Mohammed's good observation. Like once you are in those discussions, as we were a few times, you start to realize that there are nuances, like the sequence of withdrawal from the international troops could be discussed, and the conditions when the withdrawal can happen in terms of cessation of hostilities and other conditions that were, negotiated or other steps that were discussed. So actually there can easily be found once you are discussing with them a pathway to deal with those issues, as always in any negotiations. But we wanted to make from the Mary Hoch Center for Reconciliation this event available because there is an ongoing effort by the government of Somalia and international actors. As I'm not personally anymore involved, I wanted to contribute by this discussion for those who are, because to make these lessons learned available. But eventually, I just want to say that knowing how hard these efforts are, is that our prayers of safety and peace are for the Somalis that are still in the middle of chaos and conflict. And our message for those still fighting is that there is a chance. There can be a chance that can be explored for reintegrating society and ending the madness. So thank you everyone for joining this discussion. And I want to thank you, Abdullahi and Christian and Patrick and Rowda, for your efforts that you have done, your courage and your heart. And our best wishes for everyone who still continues to be in this work. May you stay safe and may you be blessed in your efforts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Antti, and everybody. It was a pleasure to participate.